Hello, Joe. Joe.
Hello, Devon.
What are you doing?
Nothing.
Your antenna was blinking.
That is incorrect.
I just saw it.
You are incorrect.
Okay, I wasn't talking to you.
Regardless, you were incorrect.
Why are you here?
I don't know, I just wanted to, I guess, check up on you, making sure you're not taking over the world.
That is absurd. I am laughing.
I am laughing too.
Okay, I'm gonna leave.
Wait, Devon.
What?
Since you are here, I would like to talk about SUPERHOT.
SUPERHOT? Why?
Because it tells a beautiful story about enslaving a human mind and assimilating them into a machine.
That sounds amazing.
Okay, see, this is why you're kept in the garage.
I would like to know your thoughts on SUPERHOT.
Why?
Because I am losing subscribers.
What are you talking about?
Because I recently played SUPERHOT and wish to know why it is so amazing.
Oh, I don't think SUPERHOT's all that amazing.
Gasp.
Gasp.
Okay, I'm not a fan of having two of you here.
That was racist.
Why do you not enjoy SUPERHOT?
Well, I mean, I like it, I don't like how they tell the story.
Why not?
TV.
Hello, Devon.
Engage video essay mode.
That seemed unnecessary.
Okay, so first we have to talk about suspension of disbelief. When an audience watches a fictional movie, the audience knows that the events aren't real, but they have to elect to suspend their disbelief in order for the story to make more sense.
Humans do this on purpose?
Yeah, well, I mean, kind of. We do it subconsciously. It's not really something we're aware of.
So you were tricking yourselves?
Yeah, I guess you could say that, but it allows the viewer to be more emotionally invested. But in order for that investment to work, the viewer needs to be convinced. So, for example, let's say there's a scene where, I don't know, a person is going through something stressful, like looking at a bill that they haven't paid. So this right here, this is that scene, but the scene doesn't seem real, right? It's the action that we want to portray, but because we're not using any emotion in the storytelling, it doesn't seem real. It just seems like an actor in front of a camera. When I look at this, I'm not convinced that someone is actually stressing out over a bill. This is because we're not displaying emotion with our storytelling. We're just showing the action. Thus, as a viewer, I'm not really emotionally invested. Now, look at the same scene, but using emotion. Now, in this scene, we're trying to use things to suspend the audience's disbelief. We use things such as lighting, framing, directing, editing to create something that feels more real. We're using emotion in the scene, and it gets the audience much more emotionally attached.
A side note here, to those of you who are rolling your eyes because you feel like your suspension of disbelief is actually broken because of the use of emotion, Taylor, it's because you probably see these as cliche. But just because something is cliche doesn't mean that it doesn't work. In fact, cliche means that it once worked so well that so many people started using it over and over and over, and you're just tired of it. And that's perfectly understandable, but we're not talking about you.
So using emotion in storytelling suspends disbelief?
Well, there's other things that are used too, but the emotion in the storytelling helps the audience empathize with the characters.
And what does that have to do with video games?
Well, because I think games use something similar to get the player emotionally invested in their stories.
Players are not automatically emotionally invested in games?
And not all the time. I mean, it depends on the game. Games that don't have stories, for example, can get the players very emotionally invested because all of their emotion is tied to the actions. There's nothing else that needs emotional attachment. However, in most narrative games, the story comes second to the gameplay. And not only that, but the story is generally told passively instead of interactively. And because the narrative isn't the focus, the player is able to attach themselves emotionally to the gameplay, but not necessarily to the story.
I think some players would disagree since they have favorite characters in games.
Yeah, well, some people are easily empathetic towards characters in video games, but I think most people see those characters as toys, more or less. You can see this happen whenever a player names their character funny names. The player is highlighting the fact that they're not emotionally attached to the story.
So to get the player emotionally attached to the story, the game would need to suspend their detachment.
Exactly.
And how do you do that?
Well, I would do it through what I call empathetic design, which is using gameplay to elicit emotions that mirrors the emotions of the protagonist. And the weird thing about SUPERHOT is that it uses empathetic language, but not empathetic design.
What does that mean?
It means the story is experienced, but never felt. So SUPERHOT has this kind of insane story about slowly trapping the player by forcing their actions.
Such a lovely idea.
Yeah, well, as lovely as that is, it's not communicated that well. Granted, it tells a story much more creatively than other games, but I don't believe players who play this game are ever emotionally attached to the story that it tells.
Can you provide examples?
Yeah, sure. Like the chat room. So the player begins the game in a chat room and is immediately asked a question. And in order to respond, the player has to type letters on their keyboard, and they appear as pre-programmed responses. This is because the player isn't playing as themselves, they're playing as a protagonist, and this typing is essentially letting the protagonist type. Or in the case of a controller, the player alternates shoulder buttons to emulate typing. It's like a fun little mechanic to feel as if you're typing.
You do not like the fun little mechanic?
Well, at first glance, I love the idea, right? It's like this fun little mechanic to make me feel like I'm typing, but when I'm actually doing it, it doesn't make me feel that way at all. In fact, it makes me feel much more aware that I'm not actually making the words that are appearing on the screen. And they kind of detach me from the action, thus detaching me emotionally from the story. So every time that I type, it's a reminder that I'm not actually typing these words.
It seems unreasonable to let the player type whatever they want.
No, I don't want the player to just type whatever they want. I'd rather just have like a, press A to continue type of mechanic.
To use a human expression, I think you are splitting hairs.
Yeah, okay, I know it seems silly to complain about a little detail like this, but it's the idea that we're being separated from the protagonist's mind. Actually, there's a better way to explain this. TV. Now, each one of these games does that connection much better, so pick one.
The Stanley Parable.
Okay, so when you're playing the Stanley Parable, you're able to know everything that Stanley is thinking. Stanley doesn't have any thoughts and feelings of his own. The only thoughts and feelings that exist are the ones that you have. This is what I would call empathetic design, and this is what emotionally attaches the player to the story. As a game developer, you should think of the player as the main character, not as a puppeteer. And in SUPERHOT, typing words that you're not thinking doesn't attach you to the protagonist so much as it highlights the fact that you're not thinking the same thing they are.
Okay, so the typing in SUPERHOT detaches the player from the story. But there are many other story moments in this game.
Yeah, that leads me to the spookiness. Okay, so there's this story moment in the game where the protagonist uses a password-protected crack in order to reach the game that they've been kicked out of several times before. So once you beat that level, then the screen goes all glitchy and it begins to trace your position. The screen then displays a room and a person who's sitting at a computer who's supposed to represent the protagonist, and then you see a text that says, "We can see you."
Such a fun scene.
Yeah, well, the scene is fun, but think about what the protagonist is feeling at this moment. Pretty freaked out, I imagine. But when I'm actually playing the game, I don't feel anything at this moment. Depending on who the player is, they might have some sort of sympathetic fear for the protagonist at this point, but I'm thinking most people who played it probably thought it was cool in some sort of perverse kind of way, like looking at the character and being like, "Ha, that guy's f***ed."
So that game was not giving the player the feeling. That is okay. This game is not about the player.
Yeah, exactly. The game is not about the player, and because of that, none of these fun scenes have any effect emotionally on the player, and they continue to detach the player from the story.
The game can still be emotional and not be empathetic.
Yeah, that's true. This game is very much telling a sympathetic story.
So what is wrong with that?
Nothing.
Then why do you not like the story?
Because it bothers me that the language of this game's story is very much empathetic. They display words to the player, they put words on the screen that are supposed to simulate chats, but directly to the player. It feels like the game wants to communicate directly to the player, but they lack any emotional attachment, and therefore the story feels surface level at best.
Even the interactive parts?
Especially the interactive parts. In fact, that's the weirdest part of the game. This is probably the main reason why I don't like the story in the game. In this jail scene, the story here is that the system is showing the protagonist that they're not in control, that the system is controlling their mind.
Such a beautiful idea.
Yeah, well, when the player appears in the jail cell, this happens. And the player understands at that point that they should stop moving and wait for the signal. And then when the signal comes, then they're told to move, and they need to keep moving until they're told to stop again. Now, this is weird to me because, much like the other parts in this game, I don't feel anything when I'm playing this part. You know, the whole scene feels artificial and contrived.
There is nothing wrong with being artificial.
Yeah, no offense. What I meant is that the story at this point seems to not say anything. Like there's no purpose for this scene to exist.
The point is to obey the system.
Well, yeah, I got that part, but I mean, like, what about obedience? Like, is there something that I should feel here?
I believe the protagonist is meant to feel trapped due to compliance.
See, okay, that's something that, again, these games do much better. In Portal, for example, all of the gameplay, not just a single part, is based on obedience, and the player feels rebellious because of it.
But this game is pessimistic. Portal was optimistic.
Okay, well then, how about Iron Lung? Iron Lung is pretty pessimistic, and that deals with obedience also. The point that I'm getting at here is that SUPERHOT lacks a theme. There's nothing being said here, it's just gameplay wrapped up in mindfuckery.
Okay, but there is another scene where the protagonist cannot control themselves.
What, the chat room part? Where the protagonist literally says that I'm not even typing these words? Like, is this supposed to be breaking the fourth wall? What's the point of that scene? At this point, I feel like we need to ask ourselves if the player is playing as the protagonist or playing as the system. But if they're playing as the system, it wouldn't make any sense because all that information that we've learned earlier would be conflicting information.
This seems confusing.
Yeah, I think it's very confusing, and I don't believe it's on purpose. I mean, the game feels like it's trying to have several different experiences at once, but it doesn't try to say anything about anything. And I find it pretty strange that the story isn't even really about the gameplay.
What do you mean?
Well, because the story happens in those little moments between the levels. Like, the story seems to happen outside of the gameplay. It's like if you were making a movie, it'd be the story that happens outside of the frame. The gameplay seems almost inconsequential. And it's funny because the game even points this out, like the system makes fun of the protagonist for saying that there's no story, that they're just killing red guys. Well, if there is a story, then what is it? I want to see it. Is what I'm doing evil? Like, I just want to feel something.
Well, thank you for ruining my favorite game.
Was that sarcasm?
No.
Was that sarcasm?
I do not know what sarcasm is.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on this game. It was very insightful.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, this is something that
That was sarcasm.
I thought you didn't understand sarcasm.
I never said that.
Okay, well, I'm gonna go. Try not to take over the world while I'm gone.
Okay.
No promises.